Hi, Sandra here from Creating in Spain. Recently I was sent a whole load of pens from Sakura. Now, amongst those were some Koi colouring brush pens. Now, they sent them to me for free. They did not ask me to do any reviews on them. They didn't ask me not to do any reviews on them. They just sent them to me. But I already have some watercolour brushes, which are Marabou ones, which I purchased in Lidl a while ago. And I do like them. I don't often use them because I tend to use normal watercolours. I just naturally reach for normal watercolours whenever I do watercolouring. I'm trying to get out of that habit because I think brush pens are quite handy. But I've had those for a while and I thought it would be interesting to see how these compare. Now this is watercolour paper, this is normal smooth cheapo cardstock, and there are a couple of differences I think you should be aware of before you buy one or the other. They are both good watercolour brushes, they just have different properties. Now it has to be said that the Koi one actually has a colouring brush pen blender. A fact which I thought was somewhat strange because watercolour brushes are watercolour, watercolour blends with water. Having felt it on my skin, it's a relatively dry brush, at least this one is, it feels slightly sticky. So I have a sneaking feeling that that has glycerin in it. Call me cynic maybe, but I think that's probably what it has inside with water, possibly. I've tried blending with it, but I really don't get on that well with that at all. So, in ease of fairness, I would just blend both lots with plain water in a watercolour brush, even using the same brush, okay? So, obvious differences, this pen is a lot shorter. So if you're looking at young children, you might think that they'll find it more easy to use. This is another inch and a half. Yeah, about another inch and a half longer. So that's what, 3 centimetres roundabouts. The reason for that is because these are double-ended. So you have a brush tip on one end and then you have what I would class as standard felt tip type tip on the other bullet point, I think is what they're called. So that's the main difference. The other difference is the firmness of the brushes. Now they are the same size pretty much. However, the one which is made by Marabou is a softer brush and more brush-like than the Sakura or Koi branded. It comes under the Sakura label, but it's Koi branded colouring brush pen. This one is firmer. Now there are times when you might want a much firmer brush. If you're trying to do a very fine detail, a firmer brush is possibly easier. However, obviously this has got a small point as well, so if you're finding the brush too big, you'd swap over and use the other end. Where this comes into its own as a stiff brush nib is if you want to do any calligraphy. This one is relatively simple to use for calligraphy because you have the control. This one is not, it's too soft. I wouldn't use that as a calligraphy pen at all. And if I was going to use that side, sorry, that's the brush side. If I was going to use the bullet side, that's not really suitable for calligraphy. So I wouldn't use that for calligraphy, but this is perfectly acceptable. And if you're any good at calligraphy at all, you should be able to make those work. So that is a major difference. Now, it has to be said that I looked at the Sakura website and they do say that you need to use these brush pens on quality paper. So if you're using them to do colouring in of mandalas and things and colouring book or whatever, you need to use a quality book because otherwise they won't blend too well. And this is amply demonstrated here. On the left, we have some blending attempts with these Sakura Koi pens. They do not blend well on my standard cheapo smooth cardstock. Not in the slightest. These pens, however, will blend on here. Not as well as they do on watercolour paper, obviously, but they will still blend. So those I could use for my normal card making, and this I would have to buy a specialist paper to make it work on, pretty much. On watercolour, I still found that these blended easier. I could blend light and dark colours together. I could blend a pale colour to a dark shade of the same colour without any difficulty. If, for example, I choose a really, really dark colour here and get the brush tip. So I'm going to put a very small amount of a dark colour just up there. And take a watercolour brush which only has watercolour, and you can see how easily that is dissolving and dragging down to a much paler concentration. Sorry if it's slightly out of focus, but it does it without any problem. Now if I take a very similar colour strength Koi and do the same thing, I can do exactly the same thing. Where I find they fail for me is when I want to do two colours together which are either greatly different on the strength of the actual colour or whether they are different colours. I found it was not as easy to blend. These blended effortlessly and these did not. Now the difficulty is that the Marabou ones that I have, only being available in Lidl, and at the time I could only get a set of 8. These are far more difficult to get. These you'll get anywhere that you get brush pens normally, whereas these you don't. And I've only ever seen the one set in Lidl, so they have them very occasionally and that's it. Now if you happen to be in Germany or maybe elsewhere in Europe, you might be able to find them actually in local shops. I don't know. They are nice enough pens and I'm sure they work well if you have the right paper to use them on. So what do you do if you're on a really, really tight budget? Well, if you're on a very tight budget, then you might have to forego the brush nibs, but there is an alternative, and it is cheap, and I'm saying really cheap. These are Carioca branded, made in Italy, children's felt tips. They are children's felt tips largely because they're washable. Washable means that the contents of them dissolves in water, and that makes them very good for colour blending. If you're using watercolour paper and you don't want a brush tip specifically, get yourself some children's felt tips. I've got a couple of samples here. So I've got the red and I've got the green. Take a water brush, this dissolves, it will blend. As simple as that. It's exactly like painting with watercolour is if you use paints from a tube or a palette. It works. So the only thing you're foregoing with this is the brush tip. This particular variety is a double-barreled one, so you've got one colour on one end and you've got another colour on the other end, both the same tip. These have got the same colour all the way through, but they have a different tip. Chunky one on one side, fine tip on the other. So if you want to do a very fine line and then you want to brush that out, you can still do it. So there we are. Off it goes. The difference, the main difference, is going to be the price, because you can buy large sets of these for a few euros and you'll probably pay at least €1, possibly 2 or more for brush nibs. So again, you know, if you're really looking for a cheap way of colouring and you're prepared to use watercolour paper anyway, and to be honest, if you're using watercolour brush pens, that's probably what you're going to end up doing, unless you buy a specialty paper, then you can use what you like. As long as the pens that you're going for are labelled as washable in the children's section, then it'll work. Easy peasy and cheap. What more could you ask? So that's it. Thanks for watching. Take care now. Bye bye.